And when he comes as Srila Vyasadeva and composes the Vedas, you come as his commentary on Vedanta. And Lord Chaitanya stated that Srimad Bhagavatam is the natural commentary on Vedanta Sutra. When Vyasadeva composed all the Vedas, he looked at it and he says, this is too much. And who's going to be reading almost 5,000 books? And even if they read them, who's going to understand them? So I have to summarize, extract all the philosophy of the Vedas into one book. And then he composed Vedanta Sutra, which has 550 sutras, short statements, which is all philosophy of the Vedas are there. And we're going to hear later, he was not satisfied, but when he composed Srimad Bhagavatam, all 550 sutras of Vedanta Sutra are present inside Srimad Bhagavatam. Vedanta Sutra is the philosophical skeleton of Srimad Bhagavatam. And Bhagavatam is Vyasadev's commentary on Vedanta Sutra as accepted by Lord Chaitanya. No one said anything like that before Lord Chaitanya did. And the Gaudiya Vaishnavas, followers of Lord Chaitanya, are the only ones who accept Srimad Bhagavatam as Vyasadev's commentary on Vedanta Sutra. So in this verse of Garga Samhita, Uddhava says that Radharani, when Krishna comes as Vyasa, Radharani comes as his commentary on Vedanta, which means Srimati Radharani is none different from Srimad Bhagavatam. So Srimad Bhagavatam is Krishna and Srimad Bhagavatam is Radharani. And maybe someone should give these two quotes to people who claim that only 10th canto is interesting, everything else is not important, or Rasa Lila, Rasa Panchadhyaya, 5 chapters on Rasa Lila, that's the real thing, everything else is not that important. Really, other parts of Krishna's body and Radharani's body are not really important. Really? Interesting. I thought the feet are most interesting, and not just staring in the face. We serve the feet. Not, stare at the face. So Srimad Bhagavatam is eternal, and it periodically appears in this world and disappears from it, or it disappears from parts of this world. It appears every Kali Yuga, but not in the same form, and not with the same goal. But it exists in the higher planetary systems where Srimad Bhagavatam has 1 million or 1.5 million verses. Now imagine if you could get that Bhagavatam. Well, who would read that anyway? It's hard to make devotees read this Bhagavatam with 18,000 verses. What to say of having them read 1 million verses? I believe that all the Vedas have about 1 million verses, or how many, I'm not sure, how many hundreds of thousands of verses. And Jiva Goswami wrote approximately the same number of verses. Now, in the beginning, Bhagavatam did not exist in this universe after the creation, and then Krishna imparted the knowledge into the heart of Lord Brahma by giving him the Chatur Shloki, the 4 principal philosophical seed verses of Srimad Bhagavatam, from which the entire Srimad Bhagavatam expands. And these are the verses from the 2nd canto, 9th chapter. They're around the verse number 30. So for Chatur Shloki, 4 verses, the philosophical seed verses of Srimad Bhagavatam, from which entire Srimad Bhagavatam expands. And Brahma kept it with him until he taught these verses to his son, Narada Muni. And then we come to Himalaya, to the ashram of, this was all happening in heavenly planets. And then we come to the Shamyaprasa, the ashram of Srila Vyasadeva, where he composed all the Vedas, 4 Vedas with their Rig, Yajur, Sama, and Atharva. And they have respectively 1,000, 100, 21 and 9 branches. And each of these branches has 4 sub-branches, which are called Upanishad, Samhita, Aranyaka, and Brahmana or mantra, which means that Vedas have 1,130 Upanishads, Samhitas, Aranyakas, and mantras or Brahmanas, which is altogether 4,520. Then there are Pancharatras, Itihasas, Tantras, Puranas, Upavedas, Vedangas, and few other groups. So it mounts altogether up to around 5,000 books. Some are quite small, like Sri Ishopanishad has 18 verses plus the invocations, and some are like Mahabharata that have 120,000 verses, 3 times the size of the Bible. And Srila Vyasadeva, who is an incarnation of Krishna, composed all the Vedas. That was the purpose of his descent to this world. And then he sat in his ashram Shamyaprasa and he was dissatisfied. He was unhappy. And at that moment, by the will of providence, his spiritual master Narada Muni comes that way, and he greets him and he asks him, "Why are you unhappy?" He said, "Well, I'm unhappy." And he tells him, "You know why? Because you didn't describe pure devotional service. You just gave people, Krishna is mentioned here and there, he's sporadically glorified in Mahabharata, and you gave people just an excuse to be materialist in the name of the Vedas. So now you should compose a book that describes only pure devotional service unto Lord Krishna." And Narada Muni gave him the synopsis of the Srimad Bhagavatam. Now this happened in Vyasadev's ashram, which is called Shamyaprasa, and that place is mentioned by name only once in Srimad Bhagavatam, and it's mentioned elsewhere in one Purana. And when you search through the width and breadth of the Puranas, you cannot find it mentioned anywhere else. I searched Bhaktivedanta Veda base, some other Acharya Veda base. I searched through some specialized websites that contain all the Puranas and Vedic scriptures. Nothing. And Srila Prabhupada mentions in his purports to Srimad Bhagavatam, this verse in Bhagavatam that mentions Shamyaprasa, it's on the western side, on the western bank of the river Saraswati. Okay, so river Saraswati stopped flowing during Krishna's time. Krishna stopped her from flowing, and she still flows a few hundred meters in the Himalayas above Badrinath in the village Manna. And on the eastern coast of the Saraswati, there's Vyas Gufa, Vyasadev's cave, where he composed the Mahabharata. He mentally recited it to Ganesh, who was sitting in the next cave, which is 2 minutes walk away from it. But that's on the eastern bank. Shamyaprasa is on the western, and everybody says it's there. It's Badrinath. But it's not Badrinath. And Srila Prabhupada in one purport in the 5th canto, I believe, says that Shamyaprasa is somewhere above Haridvar, which is true, but that's too broad, too general. And we may never have found out where Shamyaprasa is if it were not for Madhvacharya. And in one of his principal biographies called Sumadhva Vijaya, it is described how Madhvacharya went to Badrinath, to Himalaya, with a group of his disciples, and with an intent to meet Srila Vyasadeva, whom he knew and whom we know eternally lives in the Himalayas. So he came to Badrinath, went to the temple for darshan, and then came to the bank of the Alakananda Ganga river, jumped on a rock in the river, and entered meditation. And he sat there for 40 days and nights without sleeping, without eating, without drinking, just in meditation, meditating on Srila Vyasadeva, until he heard Vyasadeva's voice, "Come." He got up, jumped across the river and started walking up the Himalaya. And all the disciples, the entire group, started running after him. Now, Madhvacharya is incarnation of Vayu, the wind god, and he's as swift as the wind. How can you follow the wind? And all of the disciples fell behind except one. He felt such a pain of separation from his spiritual master that he was running all day long without stopping. You know, forget about running a marathon for 2 hours. He was running all day long without stopping, and he was running fast. He couldn't bear the separation of his spiritual master. And then, after some time, Madhvacharya just stops, turns around, and tells him, he was a short distance behind Madhvacharya, and he tells him, go back and tell the other disciples that I'm coming back shortly. I'm not leaving you. And although it was heavy for this disciple, he turned around and went back, and Madhvacharya started walking. Then the night fell, and he continued walking until he entered the celestial Himalaya, the heavenly Himalayas. And then next day, he reached Vyasadev's ashram, and there we have a description. Vyasadev's cottage, how many sages were there, which principal sages were there, how huge, how many miles was this tree wide under which he had his cottage, and Vyasadeva was sitting there in front describing Vedic knowledge. And then Madhvacharya comes, pays obeisances, and he stays in the back, and Vyasadeva looks at him and says, oh, I've heard you wrote a commentary on Bhagavad Gita. Would you like to read it to me? So we're not going to go into that details of that pastime. That's for maybe appearance day of Madhvacharya. But Shamya Prasa is not in Badrinath. It's in Adi Badrinath. It's in the heavenly planetary systems, in the heavenly Himalaya. And Vyasadeva then sat in his meditation. He took Vedanta Sutra as the philosophical skeleton, and then he built upon it the pastimes of Lord's incarnations, great devotees, as well as great demons throughout the history. And he called the book the Bhagavata Purana, or the Srimad Bhagavatam. Previously, Bhagavatam had another name. It was called Ananta Samhita, but now it's called Srimad Bhagavatam, or the Bhagavata Purana, or as Lord Chaitanya called it, Amala Purana, or the Spotless Purana, or Paramahamsa Samhita, the book for the Paramahamsas. And Vyasadeva composed Srimad Bhagavatam, but only in his head. He didn't write it down. And he didn't teach it to any of his disciples until his son Shukadeva was born. Now, regarding the appearance day of Shukadeva, now let us just mention the appearance of Vyasadeva. He was the son of Satyavati, the fisherman's daughter, and Parashara Muni. Parashara Muni came to cross the Yamuna river, and the fisherman was not there at home in his hut to row him across the river, so Satyavati, the daughter, took him across Yamuna. And Parashara Muni is the father of Jyotish. We know his famous book, Brihad Parashara Hora Shastra. And as they were crossing the river, he looks up in the sky and he sees stars and planetary constellations. And he sees this is the time and this is the place where a powerful incarnation of Krishna is going to appear to compose the Vedas. And he's looking around and there's nothing there. Nothing. And he gets a divine inspiration in his heart, and he tells this girl, the fisherman's daughter who smelt like fish. He tells her, listen, this is what's going on. Krishna is coming, he has to be born. So you and I have to conceive him. And she says, no. You're going to walk away, you're a sage, and I'm going to stay with a child. And I'm never going to get married. And he says, all right, how about this? I'll give you this blessing. You're going to keep your chastity, and your body is going to have a beautiful smell. And your other children are going to be glorious. And she thinks about it, and she says, all right. And then Parashara Muni, by his mystic power, creates an island in the middle of Yamuna, and he envelops it in fog. They conceive the child. She gives a birth to him immediately. That was one of the blessings. And that was Srila Vyasadeva. Because he was black in complexion, bluish black, like Krishna, his name was Krishna. Because he was born on a Dvipa island, his name was Dvaipayana. And because he was about to compose the Vedas, divide and compose the Vedas, his name was Vyasa. V means to separate, and Asa means the place, Asana. Vyasa, Asana, place. Vyasa, Vyasa. And Vyasa is not the name, it's the title, and it's a position. And every Kali Yuga, new person becomes Vyasa, and composes, writes down the Vedas, like 2 Kali Yugas ago, Parashurama was Vyasa, our present Vyasa, Krishna Dvaipayana Vyasa, he is 28th Vyasa in this day in this rule of Manu, and next one is going to be Ashwatthama, who is suffering in the Himalayas due to killing 5 Pandava children while they were sleeping. He cut their heads off. And he's going to become the next Vyasa in the next Kali Yuga. Until then, he's going to suffer. So Vyasa is a position. So our Vyasa was immediately born. Parashara Muni goes, and Vyasadeva tells to his mother Satyavati, whenever you need, now there's